reading Brain on Fire, My Month of Madness by Susanna Kalin. We chose this book. This will actually be one of the first books we have where it's a patient's memoir. So we've talked a lot about the patient perspective, and so we're really glad to have a book here where we'll be able to talk about that. With us today we have Amy Chang from Maimonides Medical Center, Chief Resident there, and she's the one who recommended this great read to us. We have Nikita Joshi from ALiEM Book Club, and also joining us is Leon Gusso from the Poison Review, and Chanel Fischetti, one of EM4 going into emergency medicine. So I'd like to open it up, ask Amy why she recommended this book for us.
So I remember you, Jordana, actually, telling me about this book club, and I just remember this being a really interesting read that I read recently. Like you said, it's actually a really interesting patient memoir perspective, and I think what makes it a little different is, I think, given the author's background, especially as a reporter, that she, compiles this really interesting narrative of what it's like to be a patient, going through this process of struggling with this illness that didn't have a diagnosis for a while, and the whole process of gathering information, both from patient charts, from her family records, and for her own recollections. And I think it just offered a different perspective on an environment that we are very, as physicians in hospitals are very used to, and but kind of from a different angle. A lot of her stories that she told, for example, she tells her first visit to the emergency department after her first seizure. I think it was really interesting because we see those patients a lot. We see it from our perspective, but to see it from the other side, I think was an interesting viewpoint that we don't get on a daily basis. And so we see a lot of these really familiar environments in this book, but it's seen from a different perspective as we get as physicians, as students, as residents in the medical field.
Nikita, would you like to talk about your feelings about reading this book and having what was unique for you about hearing this patient's perspective on the book?
I agree completely with Amy that this book was such a refreshing view in experience that I have every single day of my life, which is going into the hospital, but from the other side. What I liked most about this book was that in one way it was almost like a horror story that's unfolding. Here you have a young, successful woman who is living the pinnacle of her life. She's in New York City. She's got a great job. And everything starts to fall apart in such a horrific manner. The things that you tell scary stories, she's seeing things and hearing things, and the paranoia, I can't even imagine what she would have gone through. And yet, I've seen these patients so many times in the emergency department, but never really stopped to think from their side, if they were to write a memoir, what would it have looked like? And I think that's what the book appealed to me most, that kind of gut feeling of horror that this is actually happening to someone. And then the realization that this happens to people every single day.
Yeah, as I'm reading the book, I think I had this perspective of a physician reading it, thinking, have I missed this in patients? And what knowledge am I getting as a physician reading it? And then also sort of relating to the patient that I'm sort of in her cohort. She's my age. She's also career-driven, social. And what if I suffered from this illness? So I think it was, for me, very personal and many levels. Chanel, what were your thoughts on reading it? What connections did you have to the book?
Yeah, no, I mean, I echo a lot of your comments. It makes you, I think, as just going into emergency medicine, our role is to basically rule out life-threatening illnesses, and so obviously, you're trying to rule out the most serious and most common causes, and you're always, I think, looking for, horses, not zebras, but in this case, obviously, the zebra was the one to look for, and so I think that, but also, I mean, it's something very uncommon. I mean, some of these papers were even just written in 2009, 2011, and so I think it really stressed the importance of staying on top of current research and current information, but also I don't know. I think that there was a lot to be said for you know, just the patient knowing her own body and the family knowing her own body. And I can think of so many times where patients have come in and been like, or family members have been like, but this isn't normal for, you know, this patient, this isn't normal for my sister, my daughter, my brother. And so I think that there's really something to be said for that. And I think, you know, as I proceed in this career, that's something that I'll definitely take with me, just in terms of, like, they always say, like, listening to your patients is the most important part of medicine, but I don't know, something like this just really brings the gravity of what that really means to light.
Yeah, those are such valuable comments. As you were saying that, it made me think of other books that we've read recently that talked about our communication with our patients and how we could communicate better, get that story from the patient, and also help the patient tell their stories. It was the last book we read, When Doctors Don't Listen, was brought up some of those points. So that's something we try to, I think doing this book club helps us better hear patient stories and better communicate with our patients too. So actually, it was recently on the Poison Review was a post about anti-NMD receptor encephalitis. So we're really glad to have Leon here as well. I was wondering what this book meant to you, having put out that post recently.
Well, it meant several things. One is I thought it was the best case report I had ever read.
Right, definitely.
Because you can read about, excuse me 1 second. You can read about diseases from the clinical side, but unless you've experienced them, I think you really don't understand them. And it was really hard not to appreciate this condition or remember it after reading the book. Just a simple anecdote, I had read for many years about niacin-induced flushing. And until it happened to me, where I took some niacin and I thought I had the worst sunburn of my life and couldn't figure out what was going on, you know, until finally I diagnosed it after several minutes. So, and this encephalitis is relatively new. Not many people know about it, but it actually does not seem to be that uncommon. When it was studied in California, they found that it was much more common than encephalitis causes that have been known for a long time, like West Nile virus and herpes simplex. And also, from the point of view of a toxicologist, since NMDA encephalitis starts often with psychiatric symptoms, often these patients get neuroleptic agents somewhere in their course. And then when they go on to the later stages, when they develop autonomic instability and unusual movements, dyskinesias, rigidity, toxicologists often get consulted about neuroleptic malignant syndrome. And these patients have already gotten a neuroleptic agent, so it's really easy to miss the diagnosis. We had a case recently at the Poison Center that we consulted on that presented pretty much just like Miss Callahan or Cahalan in the book, and the people we were talking about had not heard of it, and it was really difficult to get them to send the appropriate tests.
Yeah. So it's, you know, I think when you know of something, it helps us diagnose it. There's a quote that I love that I learned in medical school that was, the eyes won't see what the mind doesn't know. And reading your post, reading this book, just brings awareness to this disease, this diagnosis that we're now saying is probably not that uncommon as we thought, but maybe we're just not seeing it. And it made me think, what other things are we not seeing? Or what other things don't we know? So I find that really interesting in medicine, and it's probably only through these stories, to really listening to our patients, when we're able to see that things don't fit or something else is going on here. Amy, would you like to talk about what the family meant in this story and how she was sort of able to reach the diagnosis, besides what kind of people in her life led her to reach her diagnosis? We talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think she was very fortunate, and I think she acknowledges that a lot in her book about the support she received from her family, from her friends, you know, from her physicians, because, you know, like as we were talking earlier, you know, a lot of these cases present early with psychiatric symptoms, and, you know, she's also in the age range when she, when she first presented of, early of, onset of schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders. And so, it kind of brings up the question, how many patients are we missing? How many patients are being misdiagnosed? I think she was very fortunate in the fact that she had people advocating for her when she wasn't able to advocate for herself. But and especially in a disease that is that we're only starting to learn more and more about and realize how prevalent it is, and not uncommon it is. It's important to kind of keep our mind open, and I think that was kind of one of the points that I got from this book. There's a quote towards the end of it that I really liked, when she references her physician, the doctor that ended up making the diagnosis, and she says how he encourages his students, his residents, and his colleagues to keep an open mind and to keep working and to be humble and realize that we don't know everything, and there's still a lot of things in this world that we're just learning about. So I think it's kind of interesting to see her struggle with misdiagnoses or the various diagnoses and differentials that she did have to kind of go through before she came up with her final diagnosis, which fortunately was the appropriate one.
Hmm. Yeah, Chanel, were there areas of that sort of her course of maybe diagnosis, her experiences in the hospital as a medical student that struck you as interesting or maybe angry at times? Sort of you're in your beginnings, about to start your career.
Yeah, actually, I mean, there were so many things in there that were just so interesting to hear from a patient perspective, especially someone who, is piecing this together after the fact. But I think one of the ones that definitely stood out to me, especially as a medical student, where you're so limited in your role as it is, but there's that one part of the book where I think people had figured out she had NMDA encephalitis or receptor encephalitis, and so there were a bunch of medical students or residents that had presented the case, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, this is such an interesting case. These are the symptoms. These are her chances and prognosis." Almost as if the patient wasn't there. And I think of all the times that I've, been a part of groups like that, or, rounded on patients like that, where it's almost like this patient is just like another number, just another name. And it just really brought the humanity of, what the patient goes through. And I remember in that part, the dad got so mad that he just was like, "Get out of the room." And I don't know, it's just such a different perspective. And I can't even imagine how many times that's probably happened where you're just ignorant to the fact that this is like a person,
Yeah, Amy and I had actually discussed that section often, that it's sort of, I think, embarrassing as a doctor when you read that. You kind of feel shameful and responsible for that family's experience, even though you weren't the physician team rounding on her at the time, because we've all been guilty of probably similar situations. Leon, as a doctor practicing and a very well-known teacher, what were your feelings during that section of the book when she talked about rounding and kind of being an example of an illness?
Well, I think it's always important to be, cognizant of the patients and the patient's point of view, and also the family that's present, and never lose sight of that in terms of what you're saying. I do have to say that I am retired, so I'm not currently practicing. But it's definitely important to be always aware of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd like to say that I think from the point of view of emergency medicine, the emergency department, emergency physicians have a key role in this disease, and that it's, I think, as we said before, more common than we'd expect. Especially among young people, it's more common than things like herpes simplex or West Nile encephalitis. And I think if the diagnosis is not at least brought up early on in the emergency department, it very likely will be missed or at least delayed. And it is known that early treatment definitely improves outcome. And one question that I think is still unsettled is, and this was brought up by David Carr in a podcast for Best Cases from Canada, that I know I was taught that if you have a patient with encephalitis, you don't have a diagnosis, treat empirically, or at least think of treating empirically with a cyclovir. And what David Carr brought up is that since, especially in young people, anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis is much more common, should we be thinking of treating early on empirically with IVIG and steroids? I think that question is still unanswered, but I think in the emergency department it's certainly important to at least bring up the diagnosis and include that on the differential and make sure that the patient is being admitted to know that's part of the differential. Because a lot of doctors still don't know about this disease.
Right. I think that's just such a powerful point, and I just love that role that we have as emergency doctors. I think we're often like the leaders in a diagnosis, and we set the course for our patients. So being knowledgeable and being aware of presentations and the spectrum of presentations of disease, I think I like to say that we're very good at that. And if we're able to recognize a disease like this, we can really save lives and really increase the chances of this diagnosis being recognized and getting the proper treatment. And I think also posts like what was on the Poison Review, hopefully this book club and our future posts will raise awareness of this illness and other illnesses that possibly don't have the recognition that they need. Nikita, what are any additional thoughts on this?
Yeah, I wanted to make one point that I'm really glad for the author that an ultimate diagnosis was made, and I'm glad that this book was written to bring light to a disease that actually is not as rare as we thought. But I do want to make a point advocating for all those psychiatric patients who actually present with psychiatric symptoms, have a psychiatric disorder, and I think this book does not just a great job of telling the reader about this rare diagnosis, but it highlights the really poor system we have in place for young people who get diagnosed with psychiatric symptoms and how terrifying it is for them. In the emergency department, we often will see people having their first-time psychiatric break with hallucinations and paranoia, and we don't have a great system in place. And smarter people than I know the facts about this, but the reality for us in the emergency department is that oftentimes these patients come, they're psychiatric patients, and there's not a lot of help that we can provide for them, and hopefully we can change that. So in one sense, I was glad that a diagnosis was made. I was a little dismayed once the focus kind of got away from the psychiatric side of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable point, considering, thinking of even just my last shift, how many patients I saw in that situation. And really, this book also provides that empathy, helps us gain that perspective on these patients. So we're probably going to start to close up. So if there's any other comments or topics that you would like to say, please say them now. Amy, are there any closing remarks that you'd like to?
I think, like as we discussed, there's a lot of really interesting points that I guess kind of sheds lights on how we behave and what we do as physicians that sometimes we don't really pay attention to, whether it's how we act at the patient's bedside or in front of the patient, not even directly talking to them on rounds, in the ER, like Janelle was saying earlier, a lot of times we're kind of the rule-out specialists. I tell a lot of my patients, I might not find out what's causing your symptoms today, what's causing you to come in here, but it doesn't mean that there isn't anything wrong with you, but my job is to make sure it's nothing big and scary that's going to immediately harm you. That being said, we do start a lot of diagnostic momentum in the emergency department, and I think, a book like this, a disease like this, kind of brings to light, how much that we could be missing. There's still so much out there that we don't know a lot about, and are we, a lot of these patients who present with first-time psychiatric breaks, for instance, or first-time seizures, how are we starting off that diagnostic momentum by seeing them, and in what direction are we kind of pushing that in? It's a lot of power, and it's a lot of influence, I think, that we have, and it's interesting to realize, and what's going on, and the potential of what could be going on.
Great, thank you. Chanel?
I think more than anything, I mean, it just highlighted the fact that patient advocacy is such a huge part of being a physician, but I think more than anything, it really motivated me, and there was a quote, I was trying to find it, I didn't underline it, but there was a quote at one point that Susanna's father, actually, I think that he had written a thank you note or a sign, and at the very end it said, I can't think of any more meaningful work than the work that you do. And I think it's so easy to get lost in the process of med school and residency and career and what you do every day as a doctor, whether you're an ER doctor or a neurologist or whatever. But it just really brings down the humanity of it all, and what a neat job that we have. And it's just so neat to be that intimate with someone and to really advocate for someone when they're not able to advocate for themselves. So I think, and more than anything, it just really inspired me.
Great. Nikita? Or Leon, I'm sorry. Leon.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's to me that how this disease brings out how important social media is. I had heard of it just a few years ago for the first time because a friend of a friend got diagnosed with it and did a little bit of reading. But the importance was really brought home by the Best Cases podcast, David Carr's podcast from Canada. And then I posted about it. I wrote about it in Emergency Medicine News, and there have been many other posts about it, and then this book club. And I think it would have taken much longer until knowledge about anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis became widespread without social media.
Yeah, actually, I was able to recognize this diagnosis or suggested in a patient based on what I had learned from social media. So and now getting to connect with other authors in our field who wrote about this. And actually, we were able to connect with the author herself through social media. And just gathering together like this with the group that we have now, which I think is very extraordinary. I think it's a beautiful thing that we're able to do for medicine and our patients by having this. I'm going to let Nikita give a closing statement.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. This was fantastic, and thank you to both Amy, Chanel, and Leon for joining us. We're really glad to have people who want to join in and talk with us, and it's so nice to have you all on as first-time participants. Next month for February, we're going to be doing Emperor of Maladies. So if you want to participate, please tweet us, email us, and we would love to have you join. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.